You pick up a slice of bread. It is light, cheap, and already cut for you. Most days, you barely look at it. Now, take away the supermarket. Take away the flour, the mill, the wheat field, and the oven that holds a steady temperature. What is left? Grass. Not a field of it. Wild grass, growing in patches. To make bread, you have to collect its seeds, strip away the husks, crush the grain, sift what remains, add water, then cook the dough without turning it to ash. People went through that trouble 14,400 years ago, and they were not farmers. They lived in a place archaeologists call Shubayqa 1 in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan. What they left in their fireplaces has complicated one of our neatest stories about food. The old version went like this. People began farming, grain became plentiful, and bread followed. Reasonable enough? Bread needs a lot of grain. A field puts that grain in one place. Without fields, making even a small flatbread means hunting for thousands of tiny seeds before the real work starts. Yet the bread at Shubayqa 1 came first. The people who lived there were Natufian hunter-gatherers near the end of the last ice age. They hunted. They gathered wild plants. Some Natufian groups also stayed in one place longer than earlier foragers had, long enough to build stone structures and return to the same hearths. At Shubayqa 1, the hearths held animal bones, plant remains, tools, and bits of black material that were easy to overlook. They did not look like bread. They hardly looked like food. That is part of the reason this discovery took so long. A clay pot keeps its shape. A stone blade can survive for thousands of years. A meal usually disappears. It gets eaten, decays, or breaks into pieces too small to identify. Fire destroyed these pieces, but it also preserved them. The food was charred, left in the hearth, and eventually buried. What survived was ugly and incomplete. It was also enough. In 2018, researchers examined 24 charred food remains from the site. Under a scanning electron microscope, several of them stopped looking like anonymous pieces of charcoal. Tiny spaces inside the fragments, along with particles of ground plants, matched the structure left by cooked dough. The closest comparison was unleavened flatbread. No one dug up a perfect Stone Age pita. There was no loaf, no crust you could recognize across a room. The evidence survived as burnt crumbs, and the identification came from their microscopic structure. Calling it bread does not mean it looked or tasted like a modern loaf. It was probably flat, dense, and made without yeast. The useful comparison is the process. Plants were ground into flour, mixed into dough, then cooked. That alone required planning. So, the first bread needs a warning label. This is the earliest bread-like food archaeologists have identified so far. Someone may have made it earlier. Their meal may have been eaten completely, washed away, or mistaken for dirt. Archaeology can only introduce us to the crumbs that stayed behind. These crumbs came from a fireplace used around 14,400 years ago. Farming would not become established in that region for at least another 4,000 years. Then there were the ingredients. The makers used wild plants, including the ancestors of later crops. Researchers found evidence of cereals such as einkorn, barley, and oats. They also identified club rush tubers, the underground parts of a wetland plant. None of this came ready to use. Picture the work. Someone walks out to find the plants. Someone brings the seeds back. Husks have to come off. Grain meets stone, over and over, until it becomes coarse flour. The flour is sifted, mixed, worked into dough, and placed near a fire that has no dial and no timer. Spill the grain and it is gone. Let the flour catch the wind and part of the day's work disappears. Leave the dough too close to the flame and dinner becomes charcoal. Why bother? That is harder to recover than the bread itself. Grinding and cooking may have made tough plants easier to eat. Dough also let people combine cereals with tubers in a single food. A flat piece could be carried or broken between several hands. All plausible, none proven. There is another clue, though. Wild cereals do not seem to have been a common staple for Natufian people at this time. Bread probably was not sitting beside every meal. The researchers have suggested it may have been a special food, perhaps made when a meal deserved extra work. We do this too. The food for an ordinary Tuesday is rarely the food we spend all afternoon making for other people. That does not prove a feast took place at Shubayqa 1. A burnt crumb cannot tell us whether the people around the fire were celebrating, feeding a family, or simply trying something new. It tells us something smaller and firmer. They thought the result was worth the effort. That is where the order of events starts to look different. We usually imagine farming creating the foods that came after it. First the crop, then the recipe. At Shubayqa 1, at least one recipe existed while the crop was still wild. If people had already learned to like foods made from ground cereal, then reliable access to those plants had value. A good patch was worth revisiting. Seeds growing closer to camp saved time. Over many generations, tending and planting useful cereals could make more sense. Bread did not cause farming. The shift to agriculture was slow, uneven, and tangled up with climate, settlement, population, and many species besides wheat. One fireplace cannot settle that story. It does leave room for a different one. People may have wanted the food before they built the system that made it common. That is easy to miss now. Bread arrives soft, sliced, and sealed in plastic. The field is somewhere else. So is the mill. The grinding, sifting, kneading, and careful fire have disappeared behind a price tag. For the people at Shubayqa 1, none of it was hidden. They knew where every handful came from. They knew how long the grinding took, and when the bread was finally ready, it was probably too costly to ignore. You still hold the same basic thing: crushed seeds, water, and heat. The slice became ordinary. The effort never did.